In the pinnacle of American TV shows, Breaking Bad, he is a well-known lawyer who specializes in defending criminals, so much so that even narcotics officers steer clear of him. But who would have thought that just a few years ago, he was an unknown intern, working in the mailroom of his brother's law firm. However, he was not content to remain obscure forever. Through repeated efforts, he finally earned his law license alongside his colleague, Kim. The first thing Jimmy did after getting his results was to go to his brother Chuck's office. Chuck, busy with work, had no idea that his brother Jimmy was studying for the bar exam. Seeing Jimmy's acceptance letter, Chuck could hardly believe his eyes. Chuck had struggled immensely to get his own license back in the day, and seeing his brother pass the exam while working part-time inevitably stirred feelings of jealousy. Chuck tried hard to hide his impure thoughts and gave a perfunctory congratulations to Jimmy for his achievement. Then Jimmy asked Chuck if he could hire him. Chuck was stunned at first, then remembered that Jimmy wanted to be a lawyer. Chuck said he needed to discuss it with his partners. However, when Jimmy's colleagues were celebrating with him, Howard, one of the partners at HHM, came over and asked the others to leave so he could talk to Jimmy alone. After Howard's words, it was clear that Jimmy would not be hired as a lawyer at HHM. Someone evidently thought he was more suited to working in the mailroom. It was around this time that Chuck inexplicably developed a strange allergy to electromagnetic radiation, eventually staying home and being cared for by Jimmy. Since he couldn't work as a lawyer at HHM, Jimmy decided to strike out on his own. From then on, the relentless Jimmy began to carve out his place in the legal world. Eventually, with Kim's suggestion, he started to specialize in elder law. One day, Jimmy visited a nursing home called Sandpiper Crossing to help his clients draft their wills. While he was looking for clients, Jimmy was handing out business cards. Dedicated as he was, Jimmy would not pass up any chance to turn someone into a client. After helping Irene draft her will, Jimmy charged $140. However, Irene could only find $43 after searching for a long time. Feeling embarrassed, Irene told Jimmy to take the will and that she would pay the rest after receiving her allowance next week. But Jimmy didn't do that. Jimmy left Irene an address and told her to send him the money when she had it. He also gave her a 20% discount. This showed that Jimmy had a soft spot for clients in tough situations. However, as Jimmy was about to leave, he realized something was odd about Irene's mention of the allowance. He went back to ask for details. To his shock, he learned that the allowance was what Sandpiper Crossing issued to the elderly after taking their Social Security and pension, deducting living expenses, and then distributing the remaining money. Irene thought this was convenient and everyone had accepted it. Jimmy's keen sense told him something was amiss. He gathered Irene's friends to examine the accounts. As expected, hidden in the fine print that the elderly couldn't read well was a startling secret. But clever Jimmy didn't make a fuss. He decided to gather enough evidence first. Unbeknownst to Jimmy, his actions were noticed by the receptionist, Paula. Jimmy hurried back to his brother's house to get the client files he kept there to find the evidence. Chuck guessed that Jimmy left the files there on purpose, hoping he would see them. Chuck admitted he fell for Jimmy's trick and promised he wouldn't look at the files again. Jimmy acted nonchalant and then talked to his brother about the nursing home issue. He told Chuck about the nursing home's fraud against its clients and that the evidence could be found in these bills. Since the print was too small, Chuck had to use a magnifying glass to examine it. The documents showed that a box of tissues for a client cost $14, which was clearly an overcharge. While individual amounts weren't high, consumables were used quickly, and with the nursing home's large client base, the total became substantial. Chuck couldn't believe he missed such important data in a case he reviewed. Jimmy reassures Chuck that he was probably just careless and didn't read the small print and says he just got lucky. Jimmy also looked into the fact that the nursing home was a national chain. Hearing this, Chuck advised that if Jimmy figured out their operational model and gathered more evidence, he could file a class action lawsuit. Excited that his brother was willing to help, Jimmy prepared to return to Sandpiper Crossing to collect more evidence. However, when Jimmy returned to the nursing home to register again, Paula, who had noticed Jimmy's intentions, quickly intervened to stop him. Jimmy saw through a crack that they were destroying evidence and tried to stop them, but Paula called over two big men who promptly pushed Jimmy away. Not wanting to make things worse, Jimmy pretended to leave but then had an idea. He faked a stomachache and asked to use the restroom. Paula, not suspecting anything, let him go. Once Jimmy got to the restroom, he immediately started drafting a legal notice. In no time, he had filled an entire sheet of cardboard with dense writing. Seeing that Jimmy was taking too long, Paula began urging him to hurry from outside the door. When he ran out of cardboard, Jimmy wrote on toilet paper,
"It's a Here's a demand letter informing Sandpiper Crossing of pending litigation for defrauding my clients through systematic overcharging. You're shredding in there. I'm not deaf. I can hear you. Stop right now. This makes it official, right? If you don't stop shredding right now, that's destruction of evidence. Spoliation, that's what it's called. And it's a felony. So call your lawyers right now and tell them I said that. Me, James McGill, Esquire.
But in the end, Jimmy was still kicked out. Undeterred, Jimmy waited from daylight until evening, finally seeing Paula discard the shredded documents. When no one was around, Jimmy approached the trash can, determined to make a comeback. Jimmy dove into the foul-smelling trash to search for evidence, even accidentally grabbing a child's diaper. Worse, the two bodyguards came back to dump more trash. At this time, Jimmy did not dare to make a sound, but only to endure all kinds of filth that came to his face. Just as the two bodyguards left, Jimmy's phone suddenly rang. It was Rick, the attorney for Sandpiper Crossing, calling. Rick saw Jimmy's legal notice and wanted to test the waters. Jimmy could only whisper into the phone, listing Sandpiper Crossing's crimes one by one, and betting he would find more evidence. Rick asked Jimmy to speak up, so Jimmy pretended he was listening to Mozart's opera, The Magic Flute. Realizing that Jimmy's information was indeed damaging to his client, the sly Rick quickly changed the subject. He asked Jimmy if he knew Chuck McGill since they had the same last name. After all, everyone in the legal world knew Chuck. Jimmy admitted that Chuck was his brother, having established their relationship. Rick claimed that he had called Jimmy because of Chuck. He then threatened that Jimmy's actions constituted extortion and warned that if he continued, he would face charges. But Jimmy wasn't easily intimidated. Seeing that Jimmy wouldn't back down, Rick made a tactical retreat.
Sorry for interrupting your evening. Enjoy the magic flute.
Blow my magic flute.
With nothing to show for it, Jimmy comes out of the bin and angrily kicks at it. After finally getting up, Jimmy noticed another trash can nearby. He opened it and found the shredded documents. Jimmy brought the evidence back to his brother's house. Seeing the scattered pieces of paper on the floor, it was undoubtedly a massive task. Jimmy worked through the entire night. Woke up, Chuck found Jimmy made a mess. Jimmy rushed to explain that he just needed a place to work. In fact, he also wanted to let his brother to help him. Chuck wasn't angry and agreed to let Jimmy work there, even kindly making him a cup of coffee. However, when he brought the coffee, he found that the exhausted Jimmy had already fallen asleep. Chuck put a pillow under Jimmy's head to make him more comfortable. Then Chuck continued Jimmy's work. When Jimmy woke up, he saw that Chuck had already pieced together several pages of solid evidence. Jimmy was thrilled. Chuck also took the initiative to join Jimmy's investigation, having his brother, a renowned lawyer, recognize and assist him was something Jimmy had always longed for. Next, Jimmy asked Kim for help in copying some legal documents from HHM, but Jimmy's request was too extensive and beyond Kim's capacity. It would take hours to complete. Desperate, Jimmy asked to use his brother Chuck's credentials. Immersed in the work, Chuck gave Jimmy the green light. Kim was surprised that Jimmy and Chuck were working together. Given that Chuck was in the hospital not long ago, Jimmy didn't want others to think his brother was incapable. He assured Kim that Chuck was perfectly fine. The next morning, Rick received the evidence sent by Chuck and Jimmy. Reluctantly, Rick had to cancel his schedule to handle the matter. Jimmy had been waiting for some time. He politely stepped out to greet Rick and his team upon their arrival. Considering Chuck's condition, Jimmy reminded them to leave all their phones and electronic devices in the car. Rick had heard about Chuck's condition, so he instructed his team to comply with Jimmy's request. They were seated at a table that had been prepared in advance. Chuck, who hadn't negotiated a case in a while, was a bit nervous. Jimmy encouraged Chuck, saying, "They fear you. Just sit there and look stern. I'll take care of the rest." When the renowned Chuck made his appearance, everyone stood up in respect. Rick greeted him with a big smile, even mentioning a case they had worked on together a decade ago to establish rapport. In the face of Rick's flattery, Chuck only gave a perfunctory greeting. Then they got straight to the point. Rick mocked the so-called evidence Jimmy had fished out of the trash. Jimmy sarcastically replied that if they couldn't afford a lock, anything thrown away was public property. Rick claimed that Jimmy's accusations of elder abuse against Sandpiper Crossing were unfounded. He argued that his clients were spread across the country, and wherever inspected, the elderly lived comfortably. He then said the overcharges Jimmy's clients experienced were due to an auditing error, an isolated incident that did not constitute fraud. Rick estimated that Jimmy's clients had lost about $46,000. To compensate the clients, Rick offered to not only cover their losses but also pay an additional $40,000 for emotional distress. rounding up the total to $100,000, provided Jimmy agreed to drop the lawsuit against Sandpiper Crossing. Hearing this, Jimmy produced more evidence showing that Sandpiper Crossing was engaged in interstate fraud, clearly a case of fraud, warranting at least triple damages. Jimmy scoffed at the mere $100,000 offer, calling it an insult. Throughout the discussion, Jimmy kept glancing at Chuck. Although Chuck remained silent, his presence was authoritative. If Chuck weren't there, Jimmy might lose his composure. Rick saw the situation in companions to discuss and then directly let Jimmy open a price. At this point, Chuck finally spoke. He demanded $20 million. Jimmy was shocked, and Rick hadn't expected such a high figure. Chuck stated that if they couldn't agree, they would see each other in court. This bold move caught Rick off guard, forcing him to pause the negotiations and reconsider their strategy. Jimmy thought his brother had lost his mind, but Chuck appeared confident, explaining that given their nationwide client base, this clearly constituted a federal class action lawsuit. Asking for $20 million was conservative. Chuck's expertise was still formidable. This maneuver opened Jimmy's eyes, and he was so amazed that he nearly forgot his tasks. By the time Jimmy came back with the documents, he was utterly exhausted. Chuck asked where the legal documents he had brought were, and Jimmy collapsed on the sofa, said he left them in the car and asked for a minute of rest before retrieving them. However, immersed in his work, Chuck clearly forgot about his condition. He walked straight out, took Jimmy's car keys from the mailbox, and prepared to retrieve the documents Jimmy had brought. Chuck didn't feel any discomfort. It wasn't until Jimmy, noticing Chuck had stepped outside, reminded him that Chuck felt the effects of the electromagnetic fields. This further proved that Chuck's illness was psychological, and the cause of his condition was his brother, Jimmy.